Welcome to FO Live. With me is Karimi Gatimi. She's a journalist, an author, and a teacher. We also have with us Dickens Awiti. He's a filmmaker, a producer, and he likes to call himself the jack of all trades. But both of them have a keen interest in geopolitics. Both Karimi and Dickens are from Kenya, except Karimi is joining us from Kenya's capital, Nairobi, and we've got Dickens, who's not really in Kenya. He's joining us from Brazzaville, the capital of the Republic of Congo. To our viewers, that is different from DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. So keep that in mind. But today we will talk about French President Emmanuel Macron's visit to Kenya that happened earlier this month. Welcome, Dickens and Karimi. Thank you for speaking to Fair Observer.
Thank you very much, Rohan. It's a pleasure.
Right. Let me open the stage right off the bat. And Dickens, we can start with you. Can you tell us about President Macron's visit to Kenya? Why was it being talked about so much? Why was it important?
Um, Thanks, Rohan. I think this meeting was a first. The French, they've got this equivalent of Commonwealth meetings that normally go around, the former colonies of France. So they normally have, it's basically the French version of the Commonwealth. And for the last couple of years, I think France has been trying to pivot to non-traditional, partners in a much more visible way. And I think it was a few years ago when Macron came to Kenya, and he announced that they would be having the summit, because it is a summit. They would be having the summit in Nairobi, in an English-speaking country, which is basically testament to that kind of pivot towards English-speaking countries. So that is already a first, and even in France, because I speak French, and it was a big debate. They were talking about it. Why English-speaking country? Because the French normally have this sensitive skin with everything that is English, because English almost stands in direct competition with what is French. So that's the backdrop. And of course, in Africa, now we have kind of this expanded space we live in online. So a lot of Kenyans are also exposed to the happenings in West Africa, where France has been losing a lot of ground, quote unquote. So you put all that in context. Lots of other things probably that I'll tease out as we go along. So this was important. It's important because also our president is also kind of he wants to cut a certain figure as someone who's very proactive, wants to move things. He makes a lot of wild statements which are never followed up with facts. So that's the thing. But a summit that can bring 35 presidents, 3,000 delegates, that's a big deal in geopolitics. Anytime you can bring even the power to convene 35 presidents, that's significant. And that's the significance of that summit. Yes.
Right. Karimi, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think just to agree with Dickens that it's very critical and very significant to Africa, specifically to Kenya as well, to be the one co-hosting this with France, and to realize much as it's also not the first time that we've had a relationship with France or French, because we do have businesses existing in Kenya that are very successful. We might have a different relationship with the West African side of Africa, but for East Africa, we've had a cordial relationship, especially when it comes to this creative space we have here. We've had successful relationships, and so this was significant, especially also that was very entrepreneurial for in a lot of business in France and Kenya, spirit and undertake for the president to be here. That was significant for Kenya. Yeah.
Okay, so what were the major outcomes from this summit? Because from what I know, it was a 2 day summit. But of course, there was a lot of press coverage and there were a lot of media buys. But what were the major takeaways and the outcomes of it?
Well, I can respond by saying there were major outcomes, but one would be, can I put it, the psychological shift that happened with that visit. Previously we've had, and I'll talk of Africa and then refer to East Africa and Kenya specifically. We've had where there's such international delegates and international summits that with the mindset of Africa is coming to be rescued or we're expecting aid. But this shift, the outcome of this, even from the questions that the participants, the Kenyans, the journalists from different parts of Africa were asking, were very significant. They're looking at it like this. This has to be a start of a new relationship with not just France, but with the Western world. It's not about exploitative. It's not about seeking aid or be very. So the question, we are not asking you to come invest, but we're asking if you're coming to invest.
Yeah, I think the summit was not meant to achieve much in terms of kind of economic or tangible milestones. I think this was a charm offensive, if we could call it that way, because France has been trying to pivot. So it was more of like how do you kind of create that kind of a psychologically conducive environment for French businesses to come. So they talked about billions of dollars of contracts that are supposed to be signed, infrastructure, digital transformation, health, that is. But of course, the outcome was also something which was not expected. You must have seen that incident when the French president was in a panel and there was a noisy room,
Yes.
and
And he had to
he,
get
he
up,
stood up.
yeah, he just get up
Exactly.
and
you
tell
know
people to shush.
and of course with history in the rear view mirror, when you have something like that, then it reinforces that idea that what, um, this is the old being served as new. You get.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, but I must say that France is a huge economy, one of the largest economies in the world, and if you look at it, without sentiment, I don't think it is something that is preposterous to sit down and discuss and see what kind of business deals we can get out of that relationship. Even from national perspective, you can also zoom out, continental level. France is a $3.2 trillion economy. We are Africa, the whole of Africa is 2.7. So when you have such a big economy coming, and this is not just some kind of a distant economy. This is also an economy which also has a lot of historical ties with the continent. So it's almost like you're doing business with your neighbor. You've got some things to sort out in the past. So it's not from a clean slate. France has been having lots of businesses. They do fund a lot of projects. There was one which was cancelled. I don't know how France swallowed that, because the former president had signed a toll road which was given to a French company. When the new president came in, the contract was cancelled and given to a Chinese company. So I think we also need to look at it in that perspective, that France could be looking at clawing back some ground that the Chinese have been having. So it is kind of like Karim was saying, it was, kind of something to shore up the position of France.
Hmm.
She was talking about, the creative space, for example, and I must say that, France through the French Cultural Center has done work like no other country has done to promote, the creative space. I don't think there is anybody in the theater and the music scene who can say that they've not passed through the French Cultural Center in some form or manner, to be where they are today in their career. So yeah, that's it. But it's just that thing about France now saying, look, we want to look Anglophone. You get. Yes, but let's not forget, there is a sentiment and then there are the facts. Because if you look at the major trading partners of France, they're actually not French-speaking countries.
Hmm.
It's Nigeria, number one. It's South Africa. Then you have Ivory Coast, but you also have Angola.
You also have
So that
Egypt.
was
You also have Egypt.
exactly. Yes, 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 yeah. So it's also, there's a lot of times when people talk about things, but the facts and figures could be pointing in a different direction.
Right.
Okay.
Right,
Yes.
Dickens, I want to jump right in here because you said something very fascinating, and I'm going to just give a little context to our viewers and then come back to you, Karimi, on this. What's happened very interestingly in Africa in the last 2.5 to 3 years is that France has witnessed major pushback, especially from West African countries, especially in the Sahel. So there used to be major French troop presence in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, and then we had these coups in these three countries. There's military juntas now running the nations, and they kicked out the French. Very much welcomed Russian private military corporations in. So yes, France had to flee. They had to leave their air bases behind, which have very quickly been taken over by the Russians. So France was kicked out from Francophone Africa, the same countries that they ruled over once. Do you think Macron came to Kenya perhaps looking to gain a re entry into Africa, but this time closer towards the Anglophone side and closer to Egypt, which is considered a French ally, given how they've routinely purchased their military weapons from France for decades. So France is actually playing its old geopolitical book of continuing to remain relevant in Africa. Only this time they've had to go to Anglophone parts of Africa. Karimi, what do you think?
Well, and first of all, sorry, we had a blackout, and so I've switched my internet to my phone. What I think is, I could say yes and no. Yes, in that this re-entry is significant for France, and no, in that for East Africa and for Kenya, France has been existing. Different relationship from the Sahel countries that we all know that relationship has a lot of suspicion and a lot of mistrust. So we may not have that specifically with France because we have different relationship. For many years, like Dickens has mentioned, the cultural center is over 40 years in Kenya and has supported the creative industry, continues to do that. We have even the beauty industry. We have companies in Kenya that have been many years, different relationship, especially with the entrepreneurial, the creative, and the education sectors. We've had even the French, I think it's a French agency supporting social work. So yes, in that the entry could make it more acceptable through Kenya, through East Africa, because of that relationship we've had without the history of colonialism and exploitative relationship. Again, Kenya is positioned even regionally in Africa. In addition with South Africa, Kenya is positioned as a stable economy, growing. So we have interest from every other superpower as well, including the Gulf, including the European and the US. So we have that coming to Kenya because of that strength. So France obviously wouldn't also be left behind with that. So it would be yes, an easier entry back, also with the understanding that the Kenya or the Africa of 1960s is not the Africa of 2026. So, when you come through Kenya, it's when we sit at that table, it's a very mutual, respectful relationship with any country that's coming. They're coming to where we negotiate on the same standards. And I think for us internally, some of the issues would be, unless our systems themselves are weak, if there's no clarity on the leadership, are we looking at just a temporary gain specifically for a few? But if we sit on that table of negotiating, knowing that this is not just because of the specific regime in Kenya, we are very consciously aware politically that regimes sometimes impact decisions that would either not be carried forward in the next. But if it's very clear that this is something for the nation, to not just tied to any regime, and we sit on that negotiating table, then we are very strategic partners with mutual respect, without needing anyone to come and give us aid or support, but other coming in to invest, and we have a lot to. If we are talking of things like that, then
No, no,
I
we
would
can
say
hear you. We can hear you.
I just alerted me. All right, I think power is back, so it was trying to connect back to the other Wi-Fi. Yes, I think what I was trying to what I'm saying is the re-entry through Kenya is intentional, but it goes beyond the diplomacy and the language of diplomacy. It has more strategic interest for Africa, for France. So it's very mutual and very significant for us. Yes, without the history behind, because we don't have that bad history with France.
Dickens, I want to ask, I want to open the same question to you. This? Do you think this is a way for France to come back and create more influence in Africa? Do you think the Anglophone part, going to Kenya, is going to help in any way? Or do you think this was a great attempt, but this was largely about two countries getting their bilateral relations in order, that is Kenya and France, and not really about the larger game that France is usually known for. I mean, it's the only country with the maximum amount of time zones because they've got geographical points across the world. So, what is it about? Is it really about France and its Africa policy, or is it more just about this visit specifically? Is more about just Kenya and France relations?
Yeah, so I think France is feeling spun. The exit from the three West African countries was a very painful and very shameful experience.
Hmm.
So I look at it as, a jilted lover who now wants to hang out with somebody else and say, you know what, you thought that we couldn't get other partners, like, and I think France could also be very right, because if you look at the economic numbers, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, those countries are very, very small economies.
Mm.
A total of all about $70 billion GDP. Kenya is pulling a GDP of about 120, 130. And like Karimi said, I think this is it's a layered kind of strategy. Strategy that, look, we move out of West Africa in that fashion, but we can make other strategic partners. And Kenya is a very strategic nation, in that part of the continent. You see even our president, Ruto, projects that kind of, geopolitical heft, of convening. Even this, for him, this was he wanted to be in the limelight,
Mhm.
kind of the darling of the West. He's also extremely under pressure because he's got an election next year, so he needs to fund certain development projects to give him a second term at the election. But I also wanted to say that, like Karimi said, the way Anglophones kind of went through colonization is not the same way the Francophones went through the colonization. Because if you go back, there was assimilation and almost like indirect rule in Anglophone part of Africa. So today, for example, if you talk to any Francophone, France is kind of the holy grail, Paris. Many Kenyans couldn't care less about London. If you ask them who's the prime minister of the UK, they wouldn't be able to tell you. So we have a very uh, unsentimental relationship. We tend to look like we're more business minded people. Can we get this thing done? France is they signed a military agreement to set up a military base, and I think many Kenyans wonder like, what the fuss? We have the Brits up in Nanyuki. If they can bring some jobs, things like that. So it's not really looked at as a kind of an hegemonic power, coming in. This is just like, what, we've got some space here. The Chinese are in Kenya big time,
Yes.
doing business. We've got many other partners, the Gulf states, they're funding many projects. So I would want to feel that Kenyans are less sentimental and more business oriented. That,
Mm.
what's in it for us, like Karim was saying. There's a lot of noise around the table, but let's look at the deal. What's in the deal for us?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. I want to end this conversation on getting a macro perspective from a Kenyan lens. And for that, I'll just give you a little context as to what's really happening in the world, which I'm sure you know, but just for our viewers as well. So, on one hand, you've got US President Donald Trump, who started this war along with Israel in Iran. Now, that has led to the Strait of Hormuz getting blocked. So, oil, gas, and fertilizer is all stuck in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Kenya also relies on the Strait of Hormuz for its energy needs and, of course, for fertilizer, for food, for farming that is done in Kenya. Now, that is stuck. Um, on the other hand, you've got Trump's Africa policy, which is almost certainly being run by Elon Musk, who's got a different agenda in South Africa and doesn't really care much about what's happening in the rest of the continent. Um, they've bombed Nigeria once, and said they'll do it again. So it's not like they have a holistic or comprehensive or robust foreign policy when it comes to Africa. So Africa is also looking at America with some sort of mistrust. Now, on the other hand, the other powers that you've got is China. Now, China has made immense inroads into Africa. They've invested heavily. But they've also taken a lot from Africa. China has the highest number of mining and mining equipment, but also raw earth metals that are being taken from Africa, of course, for Chinese businesses. And then the third power that you have is Russia. Now, Russia has come in at a very interesting time, given that France was getting kicked out, the UK was getting kicked out, and Russia found a way, gained some trust, and it's moved in. Then you've got, of course, India. India is a small player. They're trying their best to increase business, to increase trade with Africa. It's moving at a snail's pace. And now you've left with these two European powers who still have great influence in the region. That's the UK, and that's where we get the Anglophone Africa, which includes Kenya and South Africa. And then you've got France, which has almost certainly lost its entire influence in the West African region. Now, given all of this that is happening, what are Kenya's moves going to be like? Who are they looking at as the next future strategic partner, let's say 10 to 15 to 20 years down the line? Are they looking at the West as the future partner? Are they looking at Russia, China, perhaps India? Are they looking at the BRICS? And also, how are they feeling about this war in Iran? Because it's certainly affecting the average Kenyan. Karimi, let's start with you.
Well, as you speak, there's a saying that, and a lot of Kenyans will see that when it comes to their interests, that whoever marries my mother becomes my father. So there's that element of approach. We are very we are very focused and very clear of our interests as well to be protected, because we are a very the leading country with the most entrepreneurs. We are very entrepreneurial minded and very innovative. I think we do have innovations that have shaped even the world. For example, in the fintech world, that some of them originate, especially the one that originates from Kenya and has influenced. So for us, when we look at all these interests coming in, as I said, the only caution, we're very cautious about our own systems. Are they gonna are the systems that we have positioned to work for Kenya as a nation and Africa by extension? Or do we have some weakness? Because we do have weak systems, especially in the elements of corruption, that can impact then our interest as a nation. So we are very keen on who's coming, who's gonna marry our mother, that becomes our father. What is this nation bringing? If it is in the infrastructure sector,
Hmm.
especially, they're very instrumental for us. Is that working? Yes. If it's France, then we look at that. And the only question, really, as I said, is our systems. Are they for the interest of Kenyans? If that, then you find we are a very open nation to have discussions, to say it, because we know we have a lot to offer from our youthful population and our innovations that are still yet to be even yet known, but that are happening. Is to, when we sit on that table, is to ask them, what are you bringing on the table as well? We are not coming into bed, but we're saying we have a lot to offer. We also know there's a lot, especially like skills transfer, for us to benefit from that relationship. So we may not have a lot of mistrust that we might find in the other countries of Africa, and that's, I think that's the interest from all these other nations, the Gulf, the Europe, US. I have seen that, yes. I don't know whether I got that correct, but maybe Dickens, you can add.
Right. Dickens, do you agree with Karimi's viewpoint?
Yes, I agree. Because I think the colonial experience is a distant thing for many Kenyans. You know,
Mm.
I was even surprised when I was telling a young Kenyan about the some of the major political events that shaped Kenyan history in 1990s, and she was like, "Who was that?" You get so with this young population. No, this was a minister of foreign affairs who was kidnapped and then murdered, and this young Kenyan, who is college educated, did not know who that was.
Mm.
You know, so I think, like Karimi said, that young demography is going to be less inclined, especially the Kenyan one, on uh, sentimental things, colonial stuff. I think if these guys can get jobs, they can be free, of course. I think those are things that will be kind of academic discussions, because you see, right now we have this kind of country where a president needs to earn their re-election, or a candidate needs to earn an election. So I think what's going to shape the future, as you put it, is going to be who's going to bring some of the funding and the development goods that would enable the political system to perpetuate itself in power. Uh, if you know the recent history of Kenya, the president has launched many projects, but we don't have money to fund that. So I'm sure the system will be looking for anybody and everyone who can put money to advance that agenda. The Chinese are very easy to work with, apparently, because they can leave some kind of leeway for the big boys to eat. It's felt that the European partners are a lot more sticklers for probity and things like that. So corruption. So it depends, but I can tell you for sure that Kenyans are not going to get into philosophical debates.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be what can we get to fund our development projects? Because you've got, we are close to 60 million people. Every year, about 1 million Kenyans are getting into the job market. And I think we are creating less than 100,000 jobs. So that's a pressure. You know, those realities, they hit home more than, you know, let's say France, what are they coming to do and things like that. It's what can we do? We have jobs to create. The politicians, and of course, you know, our politicians are also less ideologically inclined. I don't know what Karimi thinks, but we don't have left or right. We don't have capitalists. We don't have socialists. We don't have communists. You know, we basically just have guys who want to ensure that they get to the next electoral dateline with something to tell the people that, you know what, this is what we've done. And for that, we deserve a second term or we want to be elected, you know. But corruption is a big problem. We've got a bloated government. Our budgets right now, apparently, we are spending, we are borrowing 50% of what we collect in taxes. So you can imagine, you know, our debt is growing at 15%. Our GDP is growing at 4%. So you've got this 9% gap that, you know, has to be plugged. And that is what the likes of Ruto are going to be looking for. The Chinese, the Turks, the Egyptians, the Indians, the BRICS, the UK, the US. I think these guys will go on a shopping spree. Wherever they get the money, they bring it home.
Brilliant. Dickens and Karimi, thank you for speaking to Fair Observer. It was a pleasure having you on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.